Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Chiteshri, and I will be your moderator for this third live Q&A session in the Climate Action MOOC. And today we have with us Ryan Jones, who is the co-founder of Evolved Energy Research. I hope I've got that correct. I'm pretty sure I have. So, and he's our expert on understanding renewables, innovative grid mechanisms, how do we look at the future of the renewables industry, and we hope to have a very engaging live session with him. Please be mindful that Ryan is joining us from, actually Ryan, I don't know the place that you're at.
I'm in Denver, Colorado.
Okay, Ryan is joining us from Colorado, which is mountain time, and me being your moderator today, I'm joining you from New Delhi. So please be mindful that we will have a session where both of us will be speaking a bit slowly to make sure that every word is caught. Please bear with us on the broadcast, and that we would like for your questions to come in live, and I will bring them to our speaker. So good evening, Ryan, and thank you so much for joining us. And I know that this is a new day for you, and I'm sorry if I am a bit tired out here, but thank you really for joining us and for being part of this cohort. Before I get on to some questions, I would just like to inform you that this is the second time that we're having the Climate Action course, and we actually have a much bigger cohort. We have about 2,350 students who have signed up for the course. They come from about 56 different countries. And they are much more engaged and much more curious about climate action than ever before. Comparatively, the size and the level of engagement that we've had this year has been significantly larger than the first instance of the course. So I'm hoping that this session is very productive and useful to many of them. We have many, many questions and a lot of people who are very interested in the renewable sector, in renewable energy sector in general. And a lot of their questions, I think, are very practical and valid from a common person standpoint, as well as we do have some students who are experts, probably to the level of expertise that you have. So, Ryan, I would just, before anything else, I would just like to ask, because for some of the students who haven't had the experience of the course before, how did you get involved with SDSN and in this MOOC in particular?
Sure. So, hi everybody. Again, my name is Ryan Jones. I'm currently working as the co-founder of Evolved Energy Research, which is a small consulting company in the U.S. And I guess I got my start in energy actually way back in undergrad as well in the U.S. Going to school in Georgia, becoming interested in climate action, and I was always very kind of engaged in science and math in school, and realized that energy was a place that kind of those interests would meet up. So that's kind of how I got my start. I went to California at Stanford for grad school, and then stayed in the Bay Area and worked in the consulting industry, doing a lot of electricity and energy work for about 7 years, and then from there kind of became more engaged in the long-term energy strategy work around climate change that is kind of foundational to a lot of the coursework for the MOOC. Worked a lot with Jim Williams, who I think gave some of the other sessions, and kind of continue to work with him. So that's a bit about my background. Happy to answer any other questions there, but yeah, really pleased to be here with you guys.
Okay, so did you get to know about the Climate Action course and the fact that this MOOC was happening through Jim?
Yeah, I think it was through Jim and his colleagues at SDSN.
Yes, because actually of all the courses that we have, this is one of the few courses that have multiple faculty members and across multiple backgrounds. So it's very interesting for our students. And while we had your lecture in the third module, we are currently in our fifth module. So that's why I just wanted to give students a bit of a background on why and how you actually came about this course. And thank you so much for telling us about how your energy journey began. Um, Ryan, you've told us about your startup and your consultancy firm. Um, am I right in assuming it was first a startup and now an established consultancy?
Well, it's a, there's kind of a gray area there, right? We've been in business for about 2 years. Um, and, it's when you start a new company, it's hard to mark the date that it, stops becoming a startup and starts, becoming a kind of a successful company. But we continue to do well and kind of have collaborated on a number of projects over the past 2 years, uh, really looking at long-term energy planning in the U.S., but a bit outside of the U.S. as well. Mexico, for instance, is one place that we've done some projects. Um, so yeah.
Okay. And could you tell us what have been the major challenges that you faced in actually integrating renewables into the grid? You've discussed this in your lecture, and we have followed it. But in terms of, could you give a more layman's perspective, and especially perhaps some personal anecdotes or the stories that you've had? Have you faced challenges which are more policy and people centric? Have you faced technological challenges? Do they vary from country to country or different experiences? Just tell us a little bit more about the work in terms of actual your experience.
Yeah, I think thus far with the working where I have in California, other places in the U.S. where renewable penetrations are, they're starting to climb, in specific geographies, but they're still relatively low in the context of deep decarbonization, or the level of renewable penetrations that we talk about in this course that are needed for climate action. So most of the integration challenges that we've, really dealt with thus far have actually been more institutional, um, more policy related than technical issues. So I would say most of the technical solutions have been fairly inexpensive uh, thus far, and certainly there's been a lot of necessary and good work that has gone into kind of studying how to integrate renewables on many different time scales and spatial scales, which is kind of the way I organized the presentation that I gave. Um, but at the very low penetration levels, um, oftentimes operational changes can really be all that's needed, and that tends to be policy, people, um, those type of issues rather than huge technical challenges where you need new steel in the ground, or different different type of solution sets that we don't have today on the grid.
While we're on the question of policy and government, since the course was shot and filmed last year, and that we have it in the second instance, the US has an entirely new government and a different president and a different administration. Have you seen any significant changes in the renewable energy policy, or in terms of people's outlook, or governments or states' reactions to the fact that there was this major change in your administration?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think there are a few parts of it. On the one hand, it takes some time um, for kind of an administration change to start trickling down to the level of kind of technical policy guidance or decisions at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission or Department of Energy or these other places. So um, that I think we've started to see that a bit, and there have been recently some good decisions I think that have been made, trying to stop some of the things that the administration has tried to do. including kind of the support payments that they were looking at for baseload energy. So that was kind of a win recently. The other thing is that most, at least in the U.S., most energy policy is actually made at the state level, not at the federal level. That's where most, certainly in electricity, that's where most regulation takes place and happens. So what we see is that the states who are out in the lead continue to lead, and in fact, many of them are doubling down. Uh, because of the fact that we have a federal government which is more obstinate. Um, and so I would say the main impact is that the states that are not leading uh, have less impetus to kind of jump on board. So I think some of a lot of um, a lot of states in the Southeast or in the Midwest um, who are not currently doing everything that they can, or doing things as fast as maybe people want on climate action. There's kind of less impetus for them to act because there's no policy push for it on the federal level. But I think those are the main impacts that we're seeing so far.
Thank you, Ryan. That's very illuminating. From what I understand, if the renewable energy sector does not have that kind of impetus and support from the governments or from the federal structures available, do you, in your experience, see more innovation and more reactive and urgent responses to these problems and challenges, or do you believe that having a proactive, supportive government structure is really very necessary for the kind of scale and change that we hope to achieve in the renewable sector?
Um, I do think so. Certainly not having the federal action does galvanize some support on a grassroots level. But I think when you look at the scale of the challenge that we're facing, and the kind of systemic change to the energy system that is involved in kind of an 80% reduction by 2050 in the U.S., that the federal government, absolutely has a large role to play, and uh, so you know it is certainly great and absolutely vital that the states that are out there leading continue to lead. But I think at the end of the day, we are going to need some type of federal policy, much stronger than kind of anything envisioned so far, to kind of put in place the kind of total suite of policy impetus that's necessary for the changes in the electricity system. Um, it's hard to say when that absolutely needs to happen. Ideally that would already be happening.
Does it
Um,
already have needed to have happened, or can it actually happen within the next 3 years?
well, I think it's less. I would say it is not likely under Trump's administration, unless there's a huge about face, I think, in their perspective on energy. But uh, I don't. But I think that we still can uh, get to where we need to be. Most of the modeling work that we have done has basically said, the later you start, the more expensive, the faster the change needs to come afterwards. And there are certainly questions about whether or not you can reach the scale as quickly as is required. Um, but 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 by no means do I think it's kind of too late if it doesn't happen in the next 3 years.
Understood. Ryan, we have a question that has come in live from Dominic Raymond, and they asked that they have a bit of difficulty understanding the concept of balancing the grid, as was
Mhm.
explained in your lecture. Could you give us some additional explanation, or talk about it perhaps in what's happened in the year gone by, or could you just elaborate on that, please?
Sure. Um, so I guess like, very fundamentally, um, in the electricity grid, you have producers of power, which are injecting energy into the electricity grid, and you have consumers of power,
Taking.
which which are you know taking down electricity, turning on lights, using appliances, etc. And the actual wires, if you think about the wires itself, the grid, which is making a circuit and electrons are flowing, um, that those circuits have very little storage inherently within that system, right? So you think about a different kind of energy system, natural gas pipelines, where you actually have a lot of storage kind of embedded in the pipeline itself, um, because the natural gas is a very dense energy medium, and it's very easy to store that in large tanks. And so in natural gas, you don't have to produce natural gas or inject it into your pipeline at the exact same moment that you consume it, right? In electricity, that's different. So in electricity, if somebody turns on on a light, um, a power plant somewhere has to respond and produce an incremental kind of additional amount of electricity to cover your light, right? And this doesn't happen instantaneously. This happens on the order of seconds, or kind of less than a second. Um, and if you have imbalance on your grid, meaning your supply and demand are not matching, then the frequency of your grid, because we have alternating current grids, the frequency will either fall or it'll rise. So if you have two less, if you don't have enough electricity on your grid, your frequency is going to fall. If you have too much electricity, your frequency is going to rise. And we're trying to keep the frequency in the US at 60 hertz, for most of the rest of the world at 50 hertz. And that's the basic concept of balancing, which is we have this kind of temporal component to electricity consumption, where we have to have supply and demand match, and match over a very short time scale.
So renewables, as I understand it, it is harder to balance this grid because the energy source, or the source from which we're deriving the energy, is not as constant. Is it because it's not generated equally?
That's
Uh,
right. So the concept we talk about is dispatchable, or
hmm,
dispatchability, which is for a power plant which we say is dispatchable, hydro, a natural gas power plant, a coal power plant. Um, if you choose to, you think about it just like your uh, pedal in your car, right? You can press the pedal down and it'll produce more energy, right? So that's a dispatchable power plant. Um, Renewables, by contrast, are at the whim of the resource which is driving it. So for solar, that's how much solar insolation you're getting. For wind, what's the wind speed at your wind farm, and that's not something that the system operator controls. Um, and and obviously the kind of the vagaries of the way that supply change will change, that doesn't match the way that the demand changes. And so that that is what that's the fundamental issue. Or when we talk about balancing renewables, um, that's kind of the crux of the problem.
okay, understood. We have another question that's come in from Teron Mackley, and they ask that some power companies are accelerating retirement of coal plants, but still want ratepayers to compensate for that utility. for the profits that they forego from their original investment. What do you think about this? What are your comments or thoughts about this? I don't know how to verify that statement or comment that they've made, but it would be nice to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so it's a tricky question. We've made a lot of investment in fossil assets that have very long lifetimes. In many places around the world, we have power plants that potentially have decades left of kind of their usable lifetime. And we potentially want to retire those early. Energy is a very capital intensive industry where financing is very important, and I think having stable kind of financing mechanisms and surety for the payback of plants is important. So somebody finance those plants, and if you have a power plant, somebody has to get paid back for it at the end of the day. And I think that ultimately in the long term, not requiring the plant owner to take the hit for those power plants actually does more to encourage kind of a healthy financing market for the electricity industry. At the same time, do I think that those plant owners should be entitled to kind of profit that they otherwise would have made? I think the answer there is no.
Okay.
That's part of the risk of doing business in kind of a competitive electricity market, I think. So
Ryan, you mentioned that life cycle of power plants and of those which are the fossil fuel based power plants. I'm curious to know, do renewables have a similar life cycle? Is it even comparable that for countries that actually have no power, and if they are investing in renewables early on, and are we looking at building something or creating something that actually does not have that same life cycle? Is that even sustainable in terms of that enormous capital investment that you just discussed?
Well, so I mean, renewables also have a very long life, kind of plant life. So on the order of 20 to 30 years, which is typically a bit shorter than, say, a new natural gas or coal plant. But then again, we don't have 20 or 30 years of operational experience for modern renewables. So those plant lifetimes are in some ways just estimates. Um, do you want to restate the second half of your question? I'm not sure I understood.
I was thinking in the context of there are countries and there are places, India, for example, a huge part of Africa, Southeast Asia, where places have been completely off the grid. And so the new investments that are going into actually bringing electricity is renewables at the first hand, whether it's hydropower, whether it's wind or solar. And I was wondering, there's always, I mean, it's common knowledge that because of the amount of investment that you have to put into renewables, a lot of governments may not prefer to start with that, or in terms of putting the grid out there, because it's risky and it's uncertain. And while things are changing, probably there isn't enough technology transfer to such places and to such countries. So I was just wondering, in terms of just life cycle and from a technological point of view, is that a safe bet now? I think you did answer my question in terms of.
Yeah, I would say it is. I think you do bring up a good, an important issue, which is that buying renewables is essentially like prepaying for your power for the next 20 years. And there are obviously risks associated with that, right? Renewables have a huge upfront component. It's upfront capital, and then you get basically very low marginal cost energy for 20 years. It's different than a fossil plant, where if you do have to course correct, it is a lot cheaper to retire a fossil plant early than it is to retire a renewable plant early. Because for a fossil plant, you're avoiding that variable cost going forward.
Okay. We have another question that's come in from Johanna Zimmerman, and they asked that, do you think that innovative waste to energy technologies will be able to significantly contribute to balancing the grid, especially industrial waste or maybe waste from household? So we're looking at energy from waste. In your experience, have you seen this happen anywhere? Or do you think that it's a potential power source for the future?
It's certainly a potential power source. I would include it on this second tier of renewables. That on the first tier, I would put solar and wind, and really I include those first because they each have the kind of technical potential to supply 100% of our energy needs using one or the other, right? And then we have many other renewable types. So many of which face their own issues. They could be very kind of, their resource could be very localized. So something like geothermal, great if you have the geothermal resource, not so great otherwise. Tidal, very similarly, wave, biomass in some context. So I think waste to energy is in this similar avenue there, which is it certainly has a role to play in some context. I don't think it has the kind of overall technical potential to be the same magnitude as wind or solar in terms of our solution set.
All right. And while we're on that, Ryan, there's another question that's come about. What is the state of art in electricity generated by tidal power generally, and in particular, maybe as a future source of energy in San Francisco? Yeah, this is the question that's come in from Struthmate. I think that's a nickname. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on tidal, so I just have to caveat with that. My current understanding of tidal is that it is very kind of site specific. So if you can find the locations, where you have a large kind of tidal difference in the high tide, low tide, fast currents, kind of large bays with a narrow opening that you can close off, it can be a great resource for some locations. And I think that there are still some technical issues that are being worked out with many of the new tidal technologies, is my understanding.
Okay. We have a more general but a very valid question from Camilla. And she asks, what needs to happen and what can we as individuals do to bring about this decarbonization of the energy grid? Ryan, I'm sure that in your work experience, you've probably actually talked about this question to different audiences in other parts of the world or in conferences or with students. And what would your advice be about actually taking action individually that would actually contribute to this process?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's there are a couple parts to this. There's a lot that needs, for individuals, there's a lot that needs to happen on the demand side of the energy system, right? So we talk about transitioning our transportation infrastructure. So electric vehicles going to be very important, kind of in a future deeply decarbonized system. If you have a lot of heating where you live, electric heat pumps paired with zero carbon electricity, that's that's a potentially important part of the solution set. When compared against, say, using something like natural gas for heating in homes. So there are things like that on the demand side that will be driven by customer behavior, and that individuals have a big role to play. There's a number of other things that are driven by that are supply side or kind of business driven, and in those things, customers have power just by kind of voicing their voting with their wallet book, right? With companies, with you know where you get your energy from, if that is a possibility, with the kind of pressure you put on companies where you live, the kind of action that gets taken on a political level, those are all kind of critical. But all these pieces work in concert.
Understood. There's a question that is an India-specific question, so I'm going to try to contextualize it a bit. It's from Dr. Narendra, who talks about that there's an Indian state, which is Uttarakhand, that has many hydropower plants. So it is a hilly state, Ryan, which is all the way up north. And there are a lot of hydropower plants that are built on the tributaries of the river Ganges, which is India's biggest river-based ecosystem. So this is the hilly state, and it's the upper river basin. And there are multiple hydropower projects that are being built, but they're not in operation because on many accounts, they have not got the environmental clearance from the ministry. So I think I'm going to broaden his question in the context of energy needs and providing opportunities for energy. If that comes at the cost or perhaps at a trade-off where environmental clearances, securities, possible future environmental threats are in question, looking at our energy needs and then looking at, of course, future disasters, what are your thoughts on this? What can we do? Is there a place in which we can meet this demand by not compromising on environmental concerns? Or is it that our energy needs are so high that, and after all, hydropower is a renewable energy source? So I'm sure you've had this question come up in different contexts, and it would be nice to get, but I'm raising, Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, I don't know this specific example from India, so I can't speak to that. But more fundamentally, I think that there are always trade-offs when we're looking at maintaining lifestyles that we have today, or basically taking the level of energy consumption that is energy service consumption that we see in the West and in Japan and different places, and exporting that to India and Africa and the rest of Asia, South America. That there is going to be large impacts no matter how you do that, right? If you talk about solar or wind or your most benign renewable energy, there are environmental trade-offs, I think, with all of these. And same thing when you talk about electric vehicles, building any infrastructure, there's extraction is a part of it. You need iron and steel and cement, and all of these have an environmental footprint coming along with it. So I think that it's a matter of priorities, and how do you trade off kind of the need for alleviating energy poverty and kind of spreading energy services with some of the costs associated with kind of higher consumption.
Yes, I agree. It's such a powerful thought when we think about the 21st century. And because I live in India and I'm aware, I'm fully aware of the energy poverty that a huge portion of our population experiences, and at the same time to think of how that comes directly at a possible environmental footprint. It's a very interesting question, and uh, I'm not sure. I mean, I do know our course touches upon various aspects of this, but I mean, that's why I think it's so good that we study sustainable development in a very broad context, so that we get an all-round understanding of various issues. And I do feel believe genuinely that people are very, very cognizant of energy needs and resources, and I think that's going to be the biggest concern of this century, to just bring everybody to that level in which, because I do know what the impact of not having access to energy is vis-a-vis to those who don't, and that is, I think, a fundamental equity issue that we need to address at the first juncture. So I fully understand the fact that every source of energy has environmental trade-offs and footprints, and I think that's a larger policy decision to consider. On this, we have Adikumbi Failu, who is and I don't know if this is, again, in your, I mean, what you've experienced, or perhaps a case that you're familiar with, but in terms of sub-Saharan Africa, do you think renewables could actually meet up to those energy needs in the coming decade? And do you see growth in the renewable energy sector for that continent and that region?
Absolutely. So, I mean, sub-Saharan Africa, actually, there are parts of sub-Saharan Africa that have very good geothermal resources, and geothermal is is great because it is what I would call a persistent kind of balancing resource, or it is a renewable resource which is dispatchable. So pairing geothermal with there's a lot of solar potential in those areas, and so, in all of sub-Saharan Africa, and I think wind. I'm less familiar with, but I know there's at least wind locally. Um, so I would say absolutely the bulk of new kind of power production for sub-Saharan Africa could be met with renewables in the coming decades. The other thing about renewables is that they are oftentimes kind of project siting and project construction is so much faster that it is if you can solve the technical challenges associated with balancing and uh, everything else, um, it is one of the quickest and frankly the cheapest way to scale the your energy or electricity grid.
Okay. Ryan, this is a more general question, and it's something that's come to my mind. We look at fossil fuels as what has been the source of energy for the last century. And then we look at renewables as a collective of various other options. Of all the renewables that we have available, do you think any has the potentially to scale to that level that is fossil fuels? Which do you think is the most promising of the renewables sector? Or is it that we really need to consider all the possibilities available, because nothing is going to match this? Just to give you context, we had this question come up when we spoke to Bill Horak, who was our resident nuclear
Hmm.
expert, and this question came to him. And he said that he believed that nuclear power was the only one that could possibly match the energy demand. But because there were so many other considerations, it's perfectly valid that we haven't jumped on that bandwagon. But because you would have a much more holistic perspective, what would you think is the biggest potential amongst the renewables?
Well, um, I I probably would not agree that nuclear alone can match the scale. Um, from a technical perspective, we certainly have enough solar and wind either to match the scale of fossil energy consumption today, right? They both, that it is a enormous amount of solar and wind resources that would need to be deployed, and it takes kind of a leap of faith or a bit of imagination kind of imagine these resources at that scale, but there's nothing I think that would, that prevents us from moving in that direction. When you talk about wind and solar, I think that these two resources in particular are very complementary uh, in this from a balancing perspective, which is if solar obviously is daylight hours. Wind for much of the world is actually stronger at night than it is during the day. And there's also some seasonal complementarity there as well, because we haven't talked about the seasonal issues, but kind of longer timescale balancing challenges are real and significant as well. So I don't think I don't think it makes sense in a high renewable context to think about all solar or all wind or all some other renewable resource, because they each of these is very dependent on the resource potential in the location that that is being investigated, right? So it'll be I think it'll be some combination of all of these.
Very interesting. Thank you.
And nuclear has a role to play there as well, right? So in a lot of the work that we do, nuclear is a part of the electricity solution set. In the context of the U.S., I certainly support them, at least the maintenance of our current nuclear fleet, because that is a huge source of zero carbon electricity currently in the U.S. And I personally support expansion of nuclear because I think that climate change is a bigger kind of
Threat.
existential
Yeah.
issue. And so it kind of comes down to the lesser of two evils when you talk about managing nuclear waste, et cetera. But, that's a different debate to be had.
Yeah, we've had that discussion and debate in the first live Q&A that we had this year. So, but thank you for a very succinct kind of overview on that question. It's always been something that we've received that question from students. It's always something that's come up in our minds as we are moderating the course. So, thank you so much. There is a question that unfortunately it's more technical, so I don't understand, but I think it's a cakewalk for you. This is regarding transmission of electricity over distance, DC or AC. Your comments regarding plus and minus considerations?
Yeah, so
if you could explain that to me.
Sure. Yeah, so basically the power system today, we have a grid that's alternating current. If you talk about trying to transmit power over a very long distance, there are advantages of doing direct current rather than alternating current. And it really comes down to a question of how far you're trying to move that energy. So because a power grid is AC, you have to convert the alternating current to direct current. Then you have a long DC transmission line, and then at the end of it, you go from direct current back to alternating current. That the conversion and process at either end has high losses, right? But the per mile losses for direct current are less than the per mile losses for alternating current.
Okay.
So the question is, how far are you going, right? How far do you need to transmit that energy? And then some other considerations like are you transmitting the energy into a new electricity interconnection? And if so, you have to do it with direct current. Kind of those type of considerations. So for places like in the US or in India, China, Europe, where we're talking about a huge concentration of renewable energy in one location and a lot of load in another,
Yeah.
I think direct current makes a lot of sense in a lot of these contexts for moving large amounts of energy a long distance.
Yeah, I do agree with you on that. Everything that I know about the energy that, for example, that's powering my house right now is not generated locally at all. So thank you for giving me some sort of scientific context to that. Um, we do even right now. This state buys electricity from another state, and another state has generated it, and it's kind of loaned and leased out, and various players that come in between. So uh, I think I'll take this as the final question, Ryan. That the economics of an individual household solar power, PV, sorry, photovoltaic, does not benefit power companies, governments, and therefore they're no longer encouraging it. This is what Simon says. Power walls in New
Hmm.
Zealand, where he's from, are offered on subscription rather than sold. What effect does this have on the grid?
Um, well,
I
there,
think you explained this about subscription in an earlier question as well.
yeah, I mean, there are a lot of impacts, right? So there are technical impacts locally, which are very manageable. If you talk to the the uh, kind of utility companies that have faced high penetrations of local distributed generation. So I'm thinking of places like in California or places in Germany where you have very high amounts of local solar. They've been more manageable than everybody has kind of feared at the offset, right? Certainly, there are some costs that are incurred, um, and it's a kind of policy question to say how do you want to allocate those costs? Do you want to allocate them to the solar customers, or do you want to socialize them or aggregate them and kind of allocate them to all customers? Um, so there's that kind of impact. There's a whole nother set of questions and impacts around rates and utility revenue requirements. So the utility makes investments on behalf of the customer. They have a what we call a revenue requirement, which is this is the pot of money that the utility needs to collect every year to cover basically the financing of all of the infrastructure that's built, and uh, how much they need to charge basically depends on how much customers consume. And if when we have for residential customers, we have volumetric rates. So you you basically get charged in a dollar per kilowatt hour basis, right? Um, but the costs that are actually uh, the cost of providing that service is very low on a marginal dollar per kilowatt hour basis, but there are high fixed costs
Mm,
associated with providing you power as a customer. So when somebody comes in and installs solar, that creates an issue where you have basically a cost shift,
mm,
um, and that's been a big policy kind of issue in the U.S. And so, I think it needs to be noted at least that policies like net energy metering,
mm,
which are kind of very common around the world, those are kind of explicit subsidies for renewables because you're able to use the power grid essentially as a battery.
mm,
Um, but at the same time, that is a subsidy that we very much may want to encourage, right? So they're kind of policy questions here, um, and I think distributed renewables have a role to play. Uh, I they're not in my mind the total solution set. So there are enough context in which distributed generation is not right for deep decarbonization, that it's kind of one piece of a larger picture.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ryan. That really does explain it in terms of we're looking at one piece in a larger picture, and the fact that deep decarbonization is such a multi-pronged um, problem and then also a solution. And the policy push and the policy impetus actually makes the economics very feasible if there is that political will to promote it. So thank you so much for a very, very illuminating discussion, Ryan, and thank you for being so patient with me. And I hope that you have enjoyed this session, and I hope that you've seen that we actually do get plenty of questions and that there's so much interest on these topics. And I think it's very encouraging that we have such an interested bunch of students who ask us such a range of questions each time and are very, very curious and working in this field in actually promoting very positive climate action in the years to come. So perhaps as a concluding and as a final note, because you are somebody who you could call, I think you can call yourself a climate advocate, as all of us are. Any final words or a message to people out there who are taking this course, what they would do with this knowledge, and perhaps what they need to keep in mind in their career paths or in their journey ahead in terms of bringing about this change?
Well, first, just thank you for inviting me to speak to everybody, and thanks everybody for the great questions. You know, I think students like these on this, course are absolutely critical, right, for the next tranche of action that we need. And you will realize when you get out and start working, and probably many in this course are already working in the industry or have, it doesn't take long until you're in a position where you can actually start having some type of small impact in whatever way, towards our solution set. So, be encouraged, I think, by that. And it's encouraging to me to see kind of so much interest from great kind of students and young people from around the world. So thanks for having me here to be a part of it.
Thank you so much for joining us, Ryan. Wishing you a very pleasant day ahead, and I hope to see you soon, maybe next year when we have the course again.
Great.
Thanks a lot.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.